Welcome back. Well, Mr. Adegboruwa, a senior advocate of Nigeria, joins us next to weigh in on that report which you just heard and some of the other items and matters that transpired in the National Assembly. Good morning and thank you for joining us on the program today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, before we go on to actually talk about that matter that the senators tried to discuss, which was, as you heard in the report, hurriedly withdrawn, citing Order 42 of the House. Equally, yesterday as well, the National Human Rights Commission did submit that report on human rights violations flowing from the answers panel. They had several recommendations. I also remember you were in the one in Lagos. So considering that and perhaps what transpired in Lagos, how do we reconcile that? Because we're also equally thinking about the bigger picture here, the ultimate intention to ensure that those kind of matters don't ever come up again in the country. So with that report submitted, what should we expect?
Well, thank you very much. I think it's first to commend the governing board of the National Human Rights Commission, Professor Ojukwu and his team, for that laudable engagement. And I think that it's part of the discussions about how to get the institutions of state to respect the fundamental rights of our people, to become more relevant to the yearnings and aspirations of our people, and then to also at the same time achieve their statutory responsibilities of law enforcement. Especially, you talk about the police, you talk about the army, you talk about the state security service, and those other law enforcement agencies, Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, Independent Corrupt Practices Offenses Commission, and all those agencies that are meant to interface with our people. The experience, judging from the proceedings of the NSAS panels in the various states, and indeed the one that sat in Abuja, is that these law enforcement agencies do not recognize the rights of our people. The mentality of the occupation of force, which was inherited from the colonialists, is still prevailing in the mentality of our law enforcement officers, especially those of the lower rank. And so the experience we have is that people's rights are trampled. You do not understand where that right would start and where it will stop. And it exists only in the consciousness of the policeman to determine the extent of the respect or enforcement of the fundamental rights of our people. But beyond the submission of the report, I think there is a challenge on our leaders, judging from the reactions to the NSAS protests, that they should match their promises and words with action. From the executive, there were assurances that the outcomes of those various panels of inquiry will be implemented. And then to the legislature, especially the Honorable Speaker of the House of Representatives, he made a vow on the open floor of the House of Representatives that he would not sign any budget or appropriation bill that does not include compensation for victims of police brutality. That was in 2020, immediately after the NSAS protests. The same thing goes for the Honorable President of the Senate. But 2 years on, they have signed budgets, they have signed appropriation bills that has not made provisions for compensation for victims. It's just the Abuja panel that submitted its report yesterday. In the various states, Ondo, Kano, Lagos, those states submitted their reports over a year ago, and they're all gathering dust. When we were sitting in Lagos, the governor made a promise that every decision made by the panel will be honored, and indeed made checks available for us to pay immediately those that were judged to be successful in their petitions. But those petitions that were heard and decisions were made and recommendations made have not been obeyed up to this morning. So I think that generally it will be good for us to put pressure on the people in authority to ensure that the victims are compensated, one. Number two, we made various recommendations about education for police personnel and other law enforcement agencies in relation to the handling of weapons, in relation to the understanding of the fundamental rights of the people, in relation to the psychology of law enforcement officers, in relation to matters involving the appropriation of finances for various agencies of the law enforcement departments of state, from what we recorded in the various panels, policemen use their money for purchase of uniform and other equipment that they use to the extent that there is a sense of abandonment. And so we feel that the aggression against the state is then transferred to the citizens. So these recommendations are quite elaborate and they go beyond just the press statements that we hear from our leaders. So it is commendable. But if it's just a matter of sitting and just making recommendations, then we have not achieved anything, as it were.
Well, concerning the conduct of security agencies, particularly the police in this case, their relationship with citizens who they relate with on a daily basis, would there be any recommendations that you'd like to see them adopt such that it will hold them a lot more accountable? Because we still hear people complain that in some areas, those actions that the citizens protested against are still being carried out by some members of the police.
Well, first of all, Chamberlain, is that you know that the NSAS protests majorly focus on two things. Issue of reformation of the police in terms of their engagement with the civil populace. And then the second aspect is about the welfare of the police itself as an organization, the officers, the equipment with which they work, and the instruments of engagement. We discovered that the accommodation of police officers is probably nothing to write home about. The places where they work, some in containers, some in very hot environment, is also nothing to write home about. And then their salary, in terms of take-home pay, is quite very poor. And so when we talk about really reforming the police, we should then take it up from the twin pillars of addressing their welfare, and then at the same time, giving them sufficient orientation to accept their subordination to civil authority. It's because if we continue to have a police force that has the mentality of superiority over the civil populace, we'll just be talking over our heads every day and won't get any result. Because as you can see, 2 years on after NSAS, policemen are still shooting civilians over 50 naira. Policemen are still on the express roads conducting roadblocks for the purpose purely of extortion. Policemen are still involved in searching telephones of citizens without recognizing the rights to privacy. So it seems that nothing really has been achieved, beyond the fact of just setting up these panels for the purpose of gaining popular acceptance, or at least trying to douse the tension amongst the youth populace. And that's why you see that almost 2 years into the remembrance of the NSAS, nothing virtually has been done by the agencies that set up these panels for the purpose of addressing, the issues raised by the youth. But I think that it's a matter of time. You see, because we're going to election year, these matters will speak eventually, when people begin to interrogate our leaders as to the promises they made to their people which have not been fulfilled.
Well, what we see with the force headquarters, the IGP's team, we understand, we've seen time and again how the force public relations officer, they try to hold policemen accountable who the citizens report, saying, perhaps report cases of violations in human treatment. So that is happening on one hand, but we're hoping that commissioners of police in different states who will toe the same line. They're holding particularly the DPOs accountable and ensure those men in their command who are deployed on the streets, a lot more needs to be seen to be done to ensure that that confidence which the force PRO is trying to infuse into the citizenry is also replicated at that level. I think when that is done, it will have a lot more impact. But moving on and speaking about the elections, which you highlighted, yesterday in the Senate, Senator Adegboruwa came up with this bill trying to see what can be done about rotational presidency to address the question of what he thinks is injustice, imbalance, representation at the presidential level. The bill didn't scale through. He hurriedly pulled it out, hoping to, who knows if he will be represented. But listen to some of the arguments that played out on the floor. I think all but one senator argued in favor of it. Almost all of them just shut it down, giving different reasons. It's against our laws. It doesn't fly. So from the point of law, listen to what they say. Do they have a point when they raise all these issues?
Yes, I just want to emphasize on, as a bus stop to the discussion on the issue of the NSAS report, is that, you see, these reports we see about infringement of the rights of our people are mostly within the urban areas. You know, the real work of the police is in the rural areas, because there's a DPO in every local government of the federation. And so you see that it's important to do a holistic reorganization and reorientation of the police, especially in the local areas where we don't get reports of the abuses of our people. Thank you. Now, in respect of this matter about rotation of offices, I believe that it's a prophecy that would come to pass, inevitably. The experience we are currently having in our nation shows that there is too much inequality, there is marginalization, and indeed, unless those issues are addressed, there will always be discontent, about the outcome of the elections that we conduct every 4 years. Maybe the challenge is that it seems that the horse has bolted, as it were. The senator did not raise this issue timeously. I mean, this is something that should have come into the front burner about a year ago. Or perhaps when the National Assembly was conducting hearings on constitutional amendment, these are issues that should have come up to be infused into the various proposals for the amendment of the Constitution. Because like one of these distinguished senators opined, Section 137, for instance, of the Constitution has given the qualifications for somebody aspiring to the office of the president. You must be a Nigerian, you must attain a particular age, you must have a particular qualification. So if you then introduce extraneous conditions that are different from those specified under the Constitution, then you probably will run into some challenges of violation of the sections of the Constitution. Then the other point is this. The bill raised by Senator Adegboruwa has to do with mostly Chapter 2 of our Constitution, in terms of, for instance, Section 14 about the federal character, in the equitable distribution of offices and positions, so that a particular section of the country will not seem to be in control of relevant offices. But when you go to Section 6 of that same Constitution, it makes everything in Chapter 2 totally unenforceable, saying that there are only directive principles to guide the state in terms of running its affairs. So when you say you want a Nigeria that is striving towards equity, justice, and fairness, the same Constitution says that you can't take those matters to the court for the purpose of enforcement. And if the National Assembly were to pass a bill, for instance, for the enforcement of rotational presidency, whereas the Constitution itself says you cannot enforce those principles, then you run into a challenge, because ultimately you need to go to court to be able to get some kind of judicial backing for those kind of legislation if they are ignored after they have been enacted. So I think the major thing is this. It's important to look back let's say we started conducting elections, for instance, in 1998. Unless something is done in terms of tinkering with the provisions of the Constitution, the majority ethnic groups will continue to lord it over the minority. And the reason why we think this is improper is when you go back to the formation of our nation, Chamberlain, right from 1954, when our forefathers were toying with the idea of independence, they then set up the Lichitun Constitution, which was supposed to have a conference of all interest groups in Nigeria to determine the circumstances under which we will exist as a nation. And then they then set up a panel which brought out a report and which says that clearly the way we should organize our nation is to give a sense of inclusion, especially to those who will not probably attain power through majority vote. And what that means is that if you conduct elections 20 times in Nigeria, it's either an Hausa man will win, or a Yoruba man will win, or an Igbo man will win. And so the idea of rotation then gives a sense of balance. When, for instance, you don't determine election through only popular votes. Because if you use political power always at your own advantage, some other people have some other things that they want to rely upon. Maybe, for instance, they have resources. And we do not conduct election to determine where or how to share oil resources. It is always those who have political power that will use those political powers to appropriate those resources to their own advantage. So you see the inequality in always insisting that you produce leaders through only elections, because you always either be somebody from the north, the Hausa Fulani, or somebody from the southwest, or probably somebody from the southeast. And this does not represent the interests of our people. So I support the bill, as it were, because indeed that is how to address the issues plaguing our nation. But I think the senator has to go back to the drawing board to see whether this bill should come by way of a constitutional amendment rather than a separate bill that seeks to amend the constitution from the back door. I think those are the things that are being raised by the senators who seem to oppose the bill, but not that is not ideal for our society as it were.
Are you by then, Mr. Adegboruwa, are you by then calling from an adjustment to our political structure? There are those who would reference the Switzerland model, where there is some form of succession system that you know who is the next president after the current one, and then the next after that one, and then the next after that one. Is that what you're proposing, an adjustment, a review of our political structure or our democratic system?
I believe that it's important from our experience so far that if we indeed aspire to have a nation that is equal and just in all its ramifications, we should have some predictability concerning certain political offices, the office of the president. It should be clear in our constitution that if the president emerges, for instance, from the southwest, it will be inequitable for the vice president to come from the southwest, or for the Senate president to also come from the southwest, or maybe for the Speaker of the House of Representatives to also come from the southwest. We should find a way now, because we have trusted this to the discretion of politicians, and they have not met the expectations of our people in terms of using their discretion to achieve justice and equity. So we should then move away from trusting those in power to continue to carry us along to the best of our interests. So in order to avoid this, it will be good to make laws that will really regulate those who occupy certain offices, such that, for instance, it will be impossible to expect the northern part of Nigeria, or probably the Hausa Fulani, to produce another president after President Muhammadu Buhari, who has spent 8 years in office. But of course, you see the template that is going on now is that nobody can predict what will be the outcome of the 2023 elections. So it creates a sense of agitation. If there is a perpetual fear that I may be marginalized, either by popular vote, I may be marginalized, either by the sharing of political offices. And the best way to curb that is to entrench a predictable atmosphere whereby it's always certain that if, for instance, Asiwaju Tinubu should emerge as president, it will be clear, perhaps, after his tenure, that office will probably go to another region. Or, for instance, if Atiku should emerge as president, we shouldn't have somebody else from this northern part of the country coming again in 2030 or thereabout to aspire to be president. We should limit it. We have failed our people in terms of using the template we have created and giving to our leaders, either in the National Assembly or in the executive, to regulate justice for our people. That has failed. If we continue to trust the Constitution as it is now, marginalization will continue, agitation will continue, and then the nation is not moving forward. So I support that there should be some legislation that will create some predictability in terms of those who aspire to certain offices. Otherwise, how do you explain that 62 years after independence, we have not had a democratically elected president for Nigeria from the Southeast? I don't understand how we could explain that in any way at all.
Well, Mr. Adegboruwa, one of the ways you proposed earlier of achieving this is for the senator to introduce it through constitutional amendment rather than by way of a bill. But if it's been difficult to get across issues as germane as local government autonomy, even state police across in the Constitution, don't you think the senator, if he introduces this through constitutional amendment, would meet the same obstacles and perhaps would not get the required votes from the north that he needs to sail through?
Well, I think that there is a lot of obligation on the part of the National Assembly, this 9th National Assembly of President Ahmed Lawan and Honorable Speaker Femi Gbajabiamila. They initiated a process on their own to amend the Constitution. So much money was voted for that exercise. Billions of naira. Consultants were engaged. People traveled all over Nigeria to conduct hearings. They have received proposals from traditional rulers, from students, from professionals, from businessmen. And these ideas have been collated and are awaiting approval for the purpose of amending the Constitution. There is an urgent need for them to proceed to conclusion on those exercises to ensure that they are not just political gimmicks meant to buy popularity from our people. Because the All Progressive Congress in 2015 made a vow in its manifesto for devolution of powers. President Buhari presented a manifesto before our people in 2015 to achieve constitutional amendment, to achieve devolution of powers, and give our people a sense of justice. So this political party called All Progressive Congress should go back home and revisit that manifesto. It has majority in the National Assembly, both in the Senate and the House of Representatives. The kind of bill being introduced by Senator Adegboruwa is part of the manifesto that APC gave to the people of Nigeria in 2015. The party should go back to the drawing board and mobilize its senators, its legislators, to be able to implement the amendments proposed for the Constitution. We shouldn't go into the 2023 election with this flawed Constitution, as it were, because people call for a national conference, they shut it down. We call for restructuring, they shut it down. The least they can do for the people of Nigeria is to conclude on the process of amendment of the Constitution, the desires of us concerning autonomy for the judiciary, concerning autonomy for INEC. There are too many issues that are bottled up in this constitutional amendment process that they shouldn't walk it over and pretend as if nothing has happened. So that would be my charge, because that is the challenge that is being raised through this kind of bill being proposed by Senator Adegboruwa. It's an indictment on the National Assembly that they should please, in the interest of justice and fair play and the people of Nigeria, proceed to conclude on the amendment process of the Constitution before their tenure expires.
Now, as we wind down, I'd like to get your opinion on one of the matters that was published today, INEC did raise concerns saying unnamed political parties overspend, they breach the rules, spending, I think, it's over 5 billion naira more than the required amount. And so in that regard, how should this kind of matter be approached? For the 2019 elections, by the way.
It's to call on the chairman of INEC, and all the commissioners, all the leadership of INEC to take hold of the 2022 amended Electoral Act and save the people of Nigeria. It's not a matter of lamentations. INEC has the power. The Supreme Court recently endorsed the power of INEC to deregister political parties. INEC has the power to observe the campaigns and funding and expenses of political power or political parties. And if he has observed any major infraction, to issue a query, to demand explanations, and if those explanations are not satisfactory, to deregister the party, to sanction the party. I'm calling on Professor Mahmoud Asitwa, the chairman of INEC, to assert his authority. We labored a lot to get the 2022 Electoral Act to be signed into law. A lot went into that act. So it's for the chairman to assert his authority, to save our democracy, and not just coming to the pages of newspapers to lament every day. Where you have observed an infraction, go ahead and enforce it. Go ahead and disqualify a political party. Most of these parties have not held their proper conventions for the purpose of complying with the Constitution. Where is their manifesto? Section 220 to 221 of the Constitution says that the aims and objectives of every political party should reflect Chapter 2 of the Constitution. Where is the manifesto of APC? Where is the manifesto of PDP or Labour Party? So it is not for INEC to just come out every day and be lamenting, but to enforce the law and then bring the sanctions down on any political party that is guilty of infraction. Otherwise, we'll just continue to dance to the tune of politicians, and then our democracy will suffer. So I'm calling on the chairman of INEC and indeed all the people who constitute the authorities in that organization to look at the relevant sections of the Electoral Act and enforce it and move our country forward beyond daily media lamentations.
Yeah, perhaps INEC will do well. We'll start by starting with naming those political parties who they say breached it, because after all, they reeled out the breaches. So who are these political parties? Nigerians deserve to know. We'll have to thank you very much indeed, Mr. Adegboruwa, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, for your time here today.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
We will be back in a moment. Stay with us.